Sir, how are you?
Hey, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
No, no, I'm all right. I'm all right. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
honoring us with your presence. It's not often we
pleasure.
get it's not so often we get someone who's quoted by the president in the State of the Nation. So it's a real honor there, and I think it's just testament to the size of the job that you have and the organization that you lead. But how are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good under the circumstances. Obviously, it's a very, very tough time for us, and
Yeah,
it's a very, very fluid environment. So we
yeah.
try to make the best of each day as we go along.
No, no, it's brilliant. I was talking to someone, and it would be interesting to find you out your thoughts about this. It's Mandela Month. It was Mandela Day recently, and he was asking me about the Mandela brand. You know, to say where's the Mandela brand? What is the future of the Mandela brand? Now, being in tourism, I'm sure the Mandela brand has been a huge pillar in attracting people. Now, I remember being in Italy, and usually before that, when I was traveling, people were like, "Oh, South Africa, Mandela, South Africa, Mandela." And for the first time last year, I said I'm from South Africa, and they said, "Oh, South Africa, black coffee." You know, so I started saying, has it shifted? And what are your thoughts on the Mandela brand and its future, especially in relation to tourism?
Well, first of all, it just gives an indication where you hang out in Duna, like coffee space. Yes, the absolutely. Mandela is synonymous with South Africa. And you're absolutely right that especially during the first phases of democracy, a very strong icon. It does a globally celebrated person, the story and everything else from that perspective there. And that the link with South Africa will continue as always to be part of it. But with anything, the story evolves over time as well. And it's so great now to see the space occupied world but it's really quite fantastic.
Sorry, I just got a call there, and I'm just trying to redo the volume. Um, Guys, please don't call me at this time. Let me see if I can.
Is my
Um,
volume or your volume?
Maybe get the earphones. Okay, no, no, we'll get the earphones. I missed you there a bit. You were saying about the Mandela brand that.
So I was saying with the Mandela brand, it's very synonymous with South Africa, especially in the first phases of democracy. And Mandela is a global icon celebrated throughout the world. And I think the affinity with South Africa really gave us a lot of groundswell. But I think with anything, identity evolves over time. And it's so great to see now these up and coming, artists like Black Coffee and other features starting to occupy that space. I mean, Miss Universe is actually South African. And again, that starts to give a bit of a more, kind of diverse picture of the country and everything else.
No, no, that's great. And I think let me just get my earphones in, and we'll sort the sound out.
Okay.
Mm, that should be better. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, no, brilliant. No, no, I think that's very vital. Now, when you market a country like South Africa, what are the pillars globally that you are marketing, especially such a diverse country. In your marketing the country, what are you concentrating on? So basically, what are you selling to the rest of the world?
Sure. So you're selling a whole lot of things. I think you're selling experiences, you're selling immersion, and you're selling a difference. And before you even contextualize South Africa, you got to sell Africa first. You'll be
Yep.
amazed at how ignorant the world is about the continent. To give a bit of
Mm,
a sense, 2015, 2016, we had the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And that the
mm,
world, however, thought that all of Africa, all 54 countries actually had Ebola. So you got to contextualize the continent first. and then give them their geography lesson, then thereafter kind of position where South Africa is at. I think the modern day traveler, especially before COVID, when I was looking for a whole couple of things, they're looking for unique experiences. They're looking for, as I said, immersion, food, flavors, taste, and all of that interaction. And I think South Africa is both a challenging and also an exciting proposition to put together. Because in most destinations, right, you could say to someone, what's the national dress of Japan? Boom, you can see it. What's the national food of Italy? Boom. Or Thailand. If I close the eyes, put something in your mouth, you could tell me which country.
You get it.
Now try to answer that for South Africa. There is no one answer. What's our national dress? It depends where you're at. What's our national food? What's our national language? And again, so it's not just one thing, but how do you encapsulate all of these things and, you know, giving something for everybody, if I can put it that way.
No, that's quite it almost adds a dimension of difficulty in itself, because you know, for the countries that you go for that singular thing, but it's an interesting opportunity because of the diversity. Now, you know, a lot of people talk about the size of the industry, how big it is, how many people it employs, and I would like to hear that from you, you know, because I think we're going to get onto COVID a bit later in terms of the actual impact, but just to have everyone who's watching to really showcase how big this industry, what numbers are we talking about here?
Okay, so let me take you probably on a macro scale. In 2019, there were 1.5 billion international arrivals around the world. 1.5 billion, right? A huge industry, right? South Africa received 10.5 million international arrivals every single year. Now, why is tourism important? Essentially, tourism is an economic driver. All you are doing is that you are importing people into your country who come and spend money. And what that does, it shores up your GDP. So whatever it is that you and I can't afford, you bring it in from externally, people spend money in the economy, and our GDP goes up as well. So that's, in essence, a key important area. You see some countries around the world, really tourism is the biggest economic driver. You know, in France, as an example, it's bigger than Airbus, you know, in terms of some of those contributions and everything else there. Now, the key thing to recognize with this is that most of our traffic arrives from the continent of Africa itself because of proximity, distance, and all of those things. So about 76% of arrivals come from the continent, but only 19% of the spend comes from the continent. Whilst outside of Africa is the converse. Like Europe is about 19% of arrivals, but about 70% of our spend, you know. So you got to balance the two, because ultimately you want people to come, but you also want them to spend as well. On average in South Africa, 1 in 23 people work in tourism. You are absolutely right that the country took a decision as part of the National Development Plan to diversify South Africa's revenue stream. We've always been reliant on mineral resources, right? And guys, the stuff out of the ground is running out. So therefore, we've got to look to new sectors to start to drive it. And then that's when the president made a decision that, you know, tourism is going to be the anchor of the economic driver, and we want to see more contribution of tourism to the GDP in itself, right? As I said, 10.2 million arrivals. We form directly about 4% of the GDP, direct contribution, and indirectly about 9%. We employ 750,000 people directly, and then indirectly about 1.5 million. Now I keep on using the directly and indirectly because the direct part is people who actually work in the hotels and the industries, etc. The indirect part is the spend that you see coming from tourism, because tourism touches on every single sector. Let me give an example. If you go to Sandton City and you go to Diamond Walk, next time just go there. Well, maybe this time is different. And close your eyes and just listen. And you hear the voices are not South African that are shopping over there. It is people that have come outside the country, they're spending money within there. The problem with it though is that that spend is recorded in the GDP as retail, not as tourism, right?
All right.
So, and that's the thing, when the tour buses go and, put fuel in the cars, that's recorded as fuel expenditure and not tourism. So there's a whole lot of ecosystems around it that is just not captured as part of it. But I think that's the trigger effect that we're looking for.
Wow. And I guess, I've spoken to a lot of CEOs on this platform. I've spoken to CMOs and brand custodians, and everyone talks about how they are affected by COVID, and I think I said earlier on, the tourism sector is probably the most affected by COVID. Now, we had a plan. It was January. We had this 2020 plan. I mean, how, when you have to really say, how have you been impacted? I mean, we all see it, that there's a great impact. But in your words, how have your sector been impacted by COVID-19?
So, if you want to talk about the poster child of the impact of COVID, you're looking at tourism. And just the start line there is that the COVID needs people to move and socialize for it to spread. We are in the business of moving and in people to interact. So those two are actually opposed, from the perspective. Also important, then when we talk of tourism, there's two parts. There's leisure tourism, but there's also what we call business tourism or business events. This is the MICE sector, the big conferences, so the ICCs that we have, typically would have like a delegation of 10, 15,000 people descending on Cape Town for 5 days and having conferences there. We saw the first impact of COVID probably about mid-February in that space. We saw big cancellations of conferences right across the board. So you can understand the impact it has when one conference of 10,000 people gets cancelled. It's all those hotel rooms, all those airport shuttles, all those arts and crafts around it, all those restaurants that would have been booked, all of those teas, coffees, the entire ecosystem, really gets yanked and moved out there. And then obviously on 26th of March, when we went into the hard lockdown, tourism was not classified as an essential sector. So essentially, all of tourism establishments had to close. Now, you are literally moving from a sector that generates 25 billion rands every month, right? Wow. About 800 million rands a day we generate. Now you've essentially just closed it. Now, what you had was a shock to the system. Suddenly now, if you think about game farms, they've got big farms, they've got lines to feed, they've got all these interactions, they've got bookings. And typically the lead time for international guests is anything between 3 to 8 months, essentially. So all of that really just came to a halt. Airlines stopped flying, literally stopped flying. Yes. So suddenly the country closed itself out and the rest of the world, everyone hibernated, And again, the issue then becomes now what was happening in those months when no trade was allowed. And, the bigger players, some of them could absorb some of the shocks, and some unfortunately were not able to, and they had to close and kind of morph themselves into something else. We also saw some making very different decisions. I mean, the very first visible one was that Protea Hotel there by Polokwane that was converted into a quarantine site, So suddenly now, hotels became mini hospitals, right? And I think that's the evolution of things, was you want those beds that are in there because they're looking for any opportunity to generate revenue and income. The Cape Town ICC, which if you had seen was actually doubled in capacity and added on, is now essentially a field hospital. And I think that's the state of the sector that we are seeing ourselves in. And it's not a South African thing, it's a global phenomenon. And it's going to be some time before things start to push out and start to open up again.
Now, there's a lot of scenario planning, there's a lot of speculation, and I'm sure your organization is doing it as well. In your prediction, what has changed in the consumer behavior. Now, when I speak to brand owners, it's in relation to their brand being bought. But in terms of the global travel, what do you think are the long-lasting effects of this global pandemic?
And I think that's the golden question, right? In
Yeah,
terms of what does the consumer want? What's the consumer behavior? What's the change? And it's like chasing a moving vehicle, because it's not absolute. Every single day we get new data points that actually inform different touch points about the consumer, right?
yeah,
And it's a very fluid situation, a very fluid environment. And as we learn certain lessons, things start to change. You know, this pandemic started off in the East, and you know, they were also the first to actually manage it and have it under control. Then you thought, okay,
yeah,
things are fine. Then you saw second waves starting to come through. And now you're starting
yeah,
to see second waves coming through, even in the likes of in Europe, as an example. In Barcelona, I was reading yesterday that it's also starting to kind of come through. Even the likes of Australia and everything else. All of these things then feed the consumer as to what it is that they think they're looking for. And I
yeah.
think things are changing on a daily basis. And, you know, safety is no longer safety about personal safety, but rather health safety, right? And I think the desire to travel is still there. The desire to be curious and interact with the world is still there, but I think it will be done differently. It will be
Yeah.
done probably with a lot of use of technology. I foresee that, um, and removing as much human contact, interaction as possible, which
Mm,
is going to be difficult for us, because part of our selling proposition as a country was Ubuntu, right?
yes. Yes.
I used to get told all the time that South Africa's secret weapon is not its beautiful weather, its landscapes, its animals, and everything else, is its people, right?
Yeah.
And now you are trying to put together a tourism offering without the people. That is your magic sauce, if I can
Yeah.
call it that. And so it's going to be quite different as to how we deliver all of this. But it's a big invite for new entrants to come in to disrupt the sector and start to deliver
Mm.
tourism in a new way that is susceptible to the modern day traveler.
Mm. Now, there's something, I mean, I worked on SA tourism when it was at a company called Island Devonport. And I don't know whether we even managed to sort out that domestic travel need. Now, we know you've explained the size of the international travel. Um, when you compare it to domestic travel, you know, like we see South Africans would rather leave than travel locally. You know, I was researching and just saw the sentiment about how people are saying, you know, um, 3 nights at the Kruger, I could go overseas. So there's that comparison. So why do I pay 20 grand when I can go to Thailand? So this desire of leaving the country by South Africans, and I think maybe there's an opportunity there. What do the numbers look like in domestic travel? And are we winning the battle for South Africans to travel domestically? Because I think that's an opportunity.
Absolutely, it's an opportunity. But just some insights is that if you look at most countries or economies around the world that have
Yeah.
a strong domestic play, they actually have a very strong um, domestic tourism sector overlaid by international one. South Africa
Okay.
is the other way around. We got a stronger international and a very weak domestic. And you could hypothesize various kind of concepts around it. One is that the majority of South Africans actually don't have travel, if I can call it, engendered within them from a very early age. Because
Mm,
of apartheid, a lot of the people just needed visas or passes to move from one town to the next, right? So
mm,
therefore, that's something that is not generally acceptable as well. What also has happened is that part of the challenge of running a destination marketing agency like SA Tourism, you're marketing something you don't own, right? We don't own the hotels. We don't own the establishments.
wow.
We don't own nothing about the entire value chain. The value chain is owned by entrepreneurs, private enterprises, who can charge whatever it is that they choose to charge, how they see fit, and everything else. And part of their fascination, call it historical, is two things that are happening. One is that they are profiling the country or packaging the country in a very thin way. And what I mean by that one, it is Cape Town, it is Garden Route, and it's Kruger, Golden Triangle. That's it, right? Everything else in between just doesn't matter. That's it. That's the first part. The second part is that all of their focus is actually overseas, euros, pounds, dollars, and everything else from that perspective. Now, conceptually, they don't put together anything or majority of things for the local consumer themselves. And for years, I mean, when I entered in SA tourism and I asked these questions, I get told for years we've been trying to incentivize the private sector, the owners of hotels and establishments, to actually reorientate the focus to domestic. And unfortunately, it just hasn't moved at all. Now came COVID. And what COVID has done is actually pressed the reset button, fundamentally. Here's what I mean by that one, is that the recovery and the opening up of this sector is going to follow the same sequence globally. It's going to be led by domestic first, right? Then regional, then international. International is going to be some time away. So therefore, it cues up now the conversation quite nicely to saying to the establishments, you no longer have a foreign currency income. You now have to, look domestically. You either have to alter your CVP or your offering, and which includes your pricing, in order to be user-friendly for the domestic market. And I think we can't lose this opportunity as a country to recalibrate that, so that when we open up internationally, we would have built it inside out and fix this uneven platform that was legacy established, and actually get that right going forward.
And we've never, I don't know whether it's a practice here, traveling overseas, I think it was Prague, in the Czech Republic, they had a tourist menu and a local menu. And the locals, because it was in Czech, ate for less. So if you're a tourist, you almost paid a tourist premium. So do you think those type of things will start happening when you get to Cape Town and there's an international menu that is a different price to the local menu, just to incentivize that? I mean, what other tactics besides just lowering the room rate? What other things would you say? I mean, let's say I own a game farm now. I'm listening to this right now, and the first point of call is to say, okay, let me lower what it costs to stay here. But what other measures, especially internationally? I mean, I use the example of the menus being cheaper for locals and more expensive for international. What other strategies would you advise someone who wants to attract more local players and local tourists, basically?
Dual pricing is something that has been adapted by certain countries across the world. I think it served its purpose at that point in time, in the 90s and probably early 2000s, right? However, we live in an environment that is in what I call dynamic pricing, right? And I think that, to me, is the more appropriate one. Basically, what I mean by that one, it's like, airline seats, right? Depending on what time of the day, depending on what time of the week, and depending on whether it's peak or off peak, you can buy the exact same seat for either $1,000 or $10,000, right? And I think essentially we need to evolve into that space. What we need to do is to provide South Africans with as much information as possible so they can make informed decisions. To say, actually, I want to go to that park, right? However, if I go on the third week of December, right, the price for that is just going to be way high, because you've got an influx of people coming to Cape Town, as an example, at the same time, and you've got international tourists. We're all fighting for that bed, and suddenly the price inflation, the bed just increases. But however, if I travel within the first week of December, which is, by the way, the cheapest week in Cape Town, the first week of December, suddenly I can get the bed at a tenth of the price. So it's essentially, how do you use technology to to give visibility so that people can make informed decisions and choices. The last thing you want to do in a modern day economy is to prescribe to business owners how much they should charge for their services. It's like me coming into your business saying, listen, for that client, you will charge him $100. And for that client, you do the exact same thing, just $1,000. It's just not feasible. And I think people find ways of bending the way around it, as an example. I mean, Zimbabwe, I'm not sure they still do it, but they used to do it. And I know of many occasions where people would travel to Zimbabwe and they would register, via local and pay the local price. However, they're getting, they're not local, as an example. I think that's the opportunity in terms of how do we use technology to empower both the consumer and the business so that choices can be made that are actually sustainable.
Wow, that's really valuable, and so we've heard some big numbers being thrown around by government departments, by government agencies, billions of rands that have been either pledged or been allocated for COVID. What has SA Tourism done to support the sector? Because, I think we've established that it's been the hardest hit sector. So what are the measures? And for the people watching, whether they are in tourism or whether they have got relatives in the space, what is still available now? So the question is in two parts. What has been done and what is still available to help the sector recover?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of communication and interaction. And I think in the second week of April, just after lockdown, we made a decision to say, let's set up a couple of webinars and let's talk about recovery, right? And you should have seen the backlash that really came back in terms of it's not the right time right now to be speaking about recovery. We are all hurting. We're trying to save our businesses and everything else. And what you find is that when you work for a public entity, is you become the focal point for everything that goes wrong in the country. So it's not about you, SA Tourism. It's about the corruption that is happening in Department of this, Water and Affairs and everything else. You just happen to be that vessel right now where I can actually just dump everything. So you're going to have a thick skin around it. So what we found that in the first and probably the second webinar, there was a lot of venting, a lot of anger, that came through. But you got to stick in with it. And I think on the third webinar, we actually said, we've got a choice. We can either team up ourselves as South African tourism and the industry itself and come up with joint solutions that actually start to address the issue. We've got a pandemic on our hands, but we can sit back and do nothing and be victims or be part and parcel of the solution. And here's what actually happened is that when South Africa came through with those 5 levels of those risk adjusted levels, level 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, tourism was earmarked and rated to only come in at level 1, meaning it could only open up when it reaches level 1. Part of the proactiveness that we did was to say, let's get together. And what we did is we actually came up with health and operational protocols that, when introduced, aim to de-risk the sector. And suddenly now, tourism didn't pose that high-end risk that was previously there, but actually brought things that are closer. And the success of that is that from 1 June, when we hit level 3, domestic tourism for business travel was allowed to actually operate. And that to me is a perfect example of the private sector and the public sector getting together and actually coming up with solutions, right? And that's been part and parcel of that process. Now, the key thing is to keep informed and engaged, right? Even though you may not have anything wonderful to pronounce and everything else there, we are all subjected to the decisions that are made by cabinet. Whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter. We just got to find a way around it and actually saying, at least we have certainty as far as what the president has announced. Let's find ways of actually working around it and make sure we can get things up and running. The story of tourism is still not a great one. And it's just not a South African story. It's a global story, right? The only tourism that is happening at the moment is actually very limited, what we call travel corridors, which are close proximity to each other. You know, mostly around Europe, where you've got countries actually visiting each other. And the reason why they're actually opening, and in my view, some are actually opening up prematurely, is because the Northern Hemisphere is in their peak tourism season right now. It's summer there. It is hot. It is when they make big money. And if they remain shut, they miss out on the opportunity, you know, from that perspective. If you look at us in the Southern Hemisphere, right, call us South Africa, look at Australia, look at even New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand is probably the poster country for success in the COVID environment. Guess what?
Yeah.
Their borders are also still closed, because they're like saying, not yet. We want to contain this. We want to make sure that everything is fine. We are doing domestic tourism, and at best, they're doing tourism between New Zealand and Australia. Only when they are confident enough will they start to open up, you know, the countries. And then lastly, I get a lot of pressure, and understandably so, from the sector that says, open up international. We want to get up and running again. We need these dollars and euros and everything else coming through from that perspective. Now, the key thing to keep in mind here is that how we handle ourselves through this pandemic right now will impact us in the longer term going forward. Basically, is that if we don't handle this pandemic very well, we will be one of those countries that are listed as, call it rogue countries. And essentially, you will find that destinations are starting to rate countries, you know, per sector. Let me give an example. You know, I was speaking to our guys in the Netherlands on Monday, and they are saying is that the Netherlands government is actually rating every single country around the world, either red, yellow, or green. Green is go, not a problem, it's safe. Yellow is iffy. Red is stay away. We've got to be careful as to how the world rates us, and they're watching how we are managing the pandemic. And I want to make sure that South Africa is rated green. And at times, it may mean hunkering in and keeping our borders closed until we reach our peak, and then start to reopen it again. You know, and I think that's the thing. The last thing you want is to prematurely open up, and you just see the infections going up. The world will shut this country down in a second if we don't get that right. And it's a very, very tight balance. But I think we can find basically our way around it.
So CEO, I'm you know, Mr. Kumalo. I'm in Richards Bay. I've put in my life saving. You know, I was a teacher. I decided to cash out because you know, tourism is booming in Richards Bay, and I've put my life savings. And I'm Mr. Potgieter in Emelo, and this is the only thing that I do. I run this BNB. You know, and as much as, you know, it's good for the future, the immediate needs of this is how I live. You know, what should I be doing in that time? You know, what is your advice to the smaller players, the guys that have got B&Bs for like 4 rooms, 5 rooms, not the big players that probably can absorb the long-termness of it? You know, what should the smaller guys that depend on this income be doing at this time?
Difficult question to ask, and a very good question as well. You know, in a normal environment, the covenant you have as a business person, as an individual you have with your government, is that it protects you and it also looks after you in times of crisis. Now, if we had a fiscus that was strong enough, right, the value proposition should be as follows, that says, Veli, I'm asking you to close your business down because we are prioritizing the pandemic. However, I'm going to put money in your business in order for you to meet your basic overheads and pay staff and. That's the exchange that should be there. The problem or challenge we have with South Africa, we don't have a treasury that's got resources. So what basically you're doing is that you're closing down in the sector, but you're also not putting in, funding to keep it afloat. And that is part of the problem. What we've seen is in many economies around the world where they actually shut down sectors. They literally bailed that sector out and said, listen, you normally make 100, but here's $20 to keep you going every single month. Now, South Africa started with that until we kind of ran out of runway. The first one was the UIF TERS. And all it was basically, it was a mechanism to say all of your employees will be paid a portion of their salary by government in order to help you, business person, to kind of keep afloat. The second one, in tourism specifically, we had what we call the Tourism Relief Fund. And essentially it was targeted at the small, really small kind of hand-to-mouth type of tourism businesses. It was a grant of up to 50,000 rands. And with the 200 million rand fund, you can only support 4,000 players over there, right? And then lastly, the other one was the generic one that was done through the banks, where the Reserve Bank kind of, credit guarantee scheme that says, listen, here's 200 billion rands. We are guaranteeing the credit of all the people applying upfront, provide them with facilities. And we've seen that something like only 10% of that facility has actually been rolled out, not just in tourism, but right across the board. So it is very difficult. It is very difficult for those that took a decision in a sector that was growing and put all of their life savings in it. And I just don't have a simple answer. Because I can't answer you when the sector will open up fully. It all depends on how we're managing the pandemic. And I think this is where you're going to need some creativity and just pure guts, I suppose.
And I guess also the big thing, I've got a few friends that play sport. Sport tourism is also quite a huge pillar, and that is also being kind of affected, and I think that is just what you were saying, that there's so many related fields to that. Now, I'm part of groups, I'm part of these WhatsApp groups, and the other day I got asked to sign a petition, and I don't know whether you know this problem, CEO, of the insurance companies. There were guys that were saying, I'm in the tourism sector, please sign this petition to support me because the insurances that we had are not sticking to their end of the bargain. Now, as SA Tourism, are you aware of this problem, and how are you helping? Because as an agency, we've got different insurances for different scenarios. When I go shoot an ad, I've got rain insurance in case it rains, and when it does rain and I've got rain insurance, I expect that insurance to pay for the advert, because that is what insurance has been. And there's this petition that the tourism insurance companies aren't coming to the table. Now, CEO, do you know about that, and how is your organization helping catalyze that? For me, as someone that is outside, to just be asked, sign this petition, I obviously signed it because there was something wrong, but surely as a body there must be something. So are you aware of that, and what is your organization doing to help those guys? Because it sounded very desperate in that group.
Yes, I'm definitely aware of it, and it actually makes me very angry. You're absolutely right, is that people enter into agreements with insurance companies hoping and understanding that they are covered should certain unforeseen circumstances happen. There's no bigger definition of unforeseen than COVID right now. It puts us in a very difficult space because you are dealing here with private contractual matters between service provider and a client, essentially. And you've got to be very careful as to how you mingle within there, especially as a government-owned entity. Now, this is the value of partnerships that I speak about, the PPPs, that are quite important. So with our partnership that we have with the tourism industry, it's called TBCSA, Tourism Business Council of South Africa, which is a private sector body representing the sector. We have actually asked them to lead the charge, right? In terms of making sure they represent the voice of all the tourism players. and take any legal or any other avenues that they see fit. And, you know, fortunately, that's the process at the moment that's going by, because one voice may not be impactful, but when an industry gets together through a united body that are able to put at least some sort of a fight, you'll see things starting to change. And we've seen one or two insurance companies capitulating already, and I think the rest will start to follow basically over time.
Now, CEO, there was, and we're moving to marketing and the marketing industry, which is a large part of what you do. Our hearts as the industry warmed up. I think that advert that was, I think it was in the first week of lockdown, was the one advert that really gave us hope and really started pointing the direction positively, you know, and I think that was a very, very beautiful ad. Now, in terms of, and I know you've gone through a process of appointing agencies and the strategies, you know, I'm interested to find out what is the future of those type of partnerships and what is the play. You know, when we have advertising accounts, we have a year's plan, you know, and we want to implement. We know what's going to happen. How is our sector, and I speak as advertising sector, affected by what is affecting the tourism industry?
Sure. So let me take you just a step back in terms of our strategy as I say tourism. If you'd asked me in January, what's your plan for the year? I could tell you exactly what we're doing. I could tell you which markets around the world are important. I can tell you where we're making investments, right? And then marketing becomes an enabler of that return that we're looking at, because ultimately we want people to travel to the country. Now, what COVID has done, it's rendered our entire business plan outdated. It's obsolete, right? I can't tell you right now which countries we should be putting money in order to get tourists coming through, right? Because I essentially don't know what the future of the country is. I don't know what the US is going to look like the next 6 months. Should I be investing in that market to make sure I've got visibility over there so that I can lure all those travelers? Maybe the numbers will go the wrong way. Maybe US will be barred from traveling anyway. And to give you a bit of a sense is that the fastest growing market for us before COVID was Brazil. I mean, that market was growing beautifully, but look what's happening over there. Suddenly I've got to pivot out of Brazil into another area. Now you ask me, where is that area? I don't know. And this is the power of data and insights that's got to be able to guide this. It can't be Sisa's favorite country on alphabetical order. But you've got to look at data, you've got to look at insights, you've got to look at predictive, you know, kind of, and then you can take a view in terms of, well, put 20 bucks over there, put 20 bucks over there, and then you can start to harness it, start to come through. So it's thrown every business plan you know out there. Where we sit at the moment is our borders are closed. I have 0 airlines flying into South Africa. So I can't assume that when we open our borders, that the airlines we used to know, A, will still exist, and B, will continue on those previous frequencies that were still there. We got to start from scratch. We literally got to go on a boat and go to visit airlines and say, listen, please fly to South Africa, please connect and everything else there. So we're literally building from scratch. And I think it's an opportunity to actually fix some of those things that are structurally incorrect, to make sure that we can stack them up and have them in place, right? The other one is that we are funded by government, right? And imagine taking 40% of your budgets immediately, right, overnight. Because what Treasury did, it says, listen, give me your money, right? And what you going to do with it? It says, well, listen, our borders are closed. You're not marketing anywhere, right? I'd rather take that money and buy more PPEs and buy more beds, because it's all about fighting the pandemic, right? And we had to really take a really sober view, if I can call it, and saying, let's prioritize in preparing a more stable future for ourselves by giving up resources to tighten that front end, so that in the longer run, we can actually have a sector to speak of. The difficulty with all of these is a balancing act, right? Because as you marketers always tell us, right, if you're out of the market for too long, the cost of getting back in will be
Yeah.
exponentially higher. But at the same time, it's very inappropriate to be marketing beautiful beaches, wonderful scenery, and everything else when
Yeah.
people are dying every single day. As long as Cape Town International Convention Center is a field hospital with sick people, right, that imagery will still be a problem, you know, that we still got to solve out. So it's about looking internally right now and sorting out our internal issues, get on top of the pandemic so that we can open up and put our front foot forward, you know, and make sure that we can put South Africa in that right space. And it's evolving. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, our country brand was really up there. Our president was hailed as one of the forward-thinking presidents and everything else. I think we're losing that edge at the moment, and we've got to find ways of regaining it again and make sure that we're the front end of it. But yeah, I mean, I can only imagine for, you know, marketing agencies that do work with us that literally 4 months ago were like gearing up to do this fantastic piece of work, and suddenly now I've got to put their hands behind their back and just wait. I'm not sure how long to wait for as well.
Now there's something very interesting, and it's something that I've been talking about quite a lot, because when everything is broken and everything needs to be rebuilt, there is an opportunity to rebuild differently, right? Now, I think part of the reason why the focus is not on domestic travel, and especially Black people, is because a large part of the tourism industry is untransformed. So it's never been a market that they look for anyway, because it's not something they understand in terms of insights. Whilst we're fighting COVID, I think it's an opportunity to look at how transformed or untransformed the industry is. I'll hear from you where that is. Transformation, let's start at the tourism industry. What does that look like? Because I think if we're targeting local people, you need local owners that have got an interest in that market. So how are we faring there in terms of the industry transformation, in terms of ownership, in terms of the people that run the actual industry? Because I think as we rebuild, that's one pillar that might actually stabilize the industry for the future. So, CEO, what is your opinion on the achievements that you have in the sector in terms of transformation of the actual industry?
Yeah, short answer is there's a hell of a long way to go in terms of transformation. The sector is a very flat triangle, right? Meaning that there are very few big corporates that are probably listed, the Tsogo Sun Internationals, probably 4 or 5 of them. The rest of the sectors are very small, medium-sized mom and pops operations, right?
Yeah.
That family-owned lodges here, et cetera, et cetera. So it's in private, individual, family-owned hands, right? And that's what's lacking, is that there are very few Black players within them. Hence, I spoke earlier on about how the country is packaged from a sales perspective. It's done through the lens of those that are operating in the sector. They know Cape Town, they know Garden Route, and they know Safari, and that's it, essentially, right? When you start to talk about township tourism, rural tourism, that's the missing gap. That's the missing piece, essentially. Now, here's a perfect opportunity to plug that in, right? You've got 2 tailwinds behind us. The first one is that things have stopped, so therefore we all press the reset button. We're all starting from zero. Secondly, as well, is that the COVID environment is all about social distancing, right? And our open rural spaces lend themselves naturally to that, if you get what I'm saying, right? Suddenly now, the 2,000 bedroom hotel is no longer something to desire for than a small lodge of 5, 8 bedrooms that your entire family can occupy at once, as an example. And I think that's where the thing is at. certainly our job, as I say, tourism, and I can proudly say this, is that we want to shine the light on those areas of the country that essentially have been lacking in terms of tourism activity, right? So we don't operate, we don't own anything, but we want to invite new players to come in. We want to invite you guys to come into the sector. The one phenomenon that you see with a lot of the people that actually are operating in the tourism sector, they made money elsewhere and invested it in tourism, and that's kind of leaving that lifestyle coming through. It's very difficult to start from scratch with the loan and everything else and start an establishment, within the tourism space. So I would say to many of you, let's start to think differently from being consumers of tourism. Yes, we all love to travel, but let's think about the opportunities of being participants of tourism in its sector, right? And please don't go to the obvious places that are already there, right? Look at the other areas of the country. I always feel that each township should have a Vilakazi street, as an example, right? How do you bring out the characteristics of each township? I want to see more tour buses going to those spaces where they eat local food, interact with the local, engage with the local. Because the one thing that tourists are always looking for, they're saying, show me where tourists don't go. I want to go where the locals go, right? So if you start to look at the transformations of the Braam environment, as an example, how many more of those can be done? And you don't need government's permission or government's incentive to do that. It just needs to be a movement that we can support and drive from our side and make sure that happens. Because the worst thing you can do is when people are excluded, they destroy. But when they're included, they actually protect.
Profound.
Right? And we've got to put tourism in the space that actually when we see a tourist coming through, we should all celebrate because they are spending money in the economy. Maybe not directly with me, but essentially that money will filter through. It is when that becomes a problem that money never filters through. There's no interaction. A tour bus comes through to Soweto and you see people with cameras taking pictures. They never interact with you. And the tour bus leaves. Then you start to become like, okay, am I now an object to be photographed? And I think it's that thing that we want to change, how we look at tourists, to saying actually we should be welcoming people into our townships. We should be telling our stories, that every single one of us, irrespective of where you're at, right, can actually play a role within